Welcome to Wellness Radio with Dr. Jeanette-Gallagher as your host. Her show discusses topics of health, wellness, and spirituality, and is about discovering your place in this great universe, from your cells to the cosmos. Along with her guest, in casual conversation, she strives to ask the difficult questions that may be holding you back from a vibrant life, and shares new ideas that may inspire you to make a change in your life that you only can see in your dreams. And now, here is Dr. Jeanette-Gallagher.
Good evening, everyone, and welcome to Wellness Radio. This is Dr. Jeanette-Gallagher, and it's a pleasure to have you with us here this evening. Tonight, we are going to be talking about a wonderful medical mystery novel. Sometimes these novels almost seem, gosh, I could find myself in this page and that page, and I wonder how the story plays out. Do we use novels to become triggers to look at our own life in reflection? Do we take novels to say, ooh, that could never happen? All of a sudden, a few years later, you say, I read that someplace. Yes, that can be reality. What is truth? What is a belief? What is something that, I have no idea? And we go out and we explore and we say, can these things happen in real life? What is reality these days? Are we skewing and putting it into a little fuzzy kind of paradigm box? Because what we thought was the right way to live, the right way to be, the right way to exist, and how stories would play out, we are really on another trajectory where we're saying, hey, I did this to them. Something happened out there, and this really, truly did happen in a medical context, in a family, or in our lineage. What are the stories and the secrets? Today, my guest is Donald-Hricik. His book is Toxic Affairs on Hidden Lane, a novel, and definitely there are a lot of secrets in here. So what really is reality? It's a great book to be able to sit down and read. And boy, when I read it, I started at the beginning, stay there right till the end. Definitely holds your interest. Dr. Donald, thank you so much for joining us today. It's a pleasure to have you with us.
Well, thank you. Thank you for having me on your show, Dr. Jeanette.
I'm so glad to have you about this book because I had no idea what it was going to be about. The picture on the front doesn't give it away. And when you start reading it, it's like, no way, this can't be happening. And don't you think sometimes reality ends up being, skewed these days?
Well, I was very intrigued by your opening comments and touches on some very good points about fictions in general. Because oftentimes, I'm asked, and you may ask the same thing, what exactly prompted you to write this particular story? And authors are usually, authors of fiction almost always include disclaimers in the book that, this is totally fictional and any resemblance of characters, real characters, are imaginary only. But the reality is all fictions are based on some semblance of reality.
Right.
And I'm a retired physician with a medical background, and this, like most of my other books, is one that I wanted to focus on one particular health issue, and that's kind of the issue of chemical pollutants that increasingly surround us all and how they can affect our health. And so that's the background for the mystery that involves in Toxic Affairs.
Yeah, because, what I really think was really interesting is that how do chemicals get into our life? How do they get into our bodies? How do they get into our environment? And truly, what is the use or the misuse of them, right?
So I don't want to give away the mystery of the book. In fact, as you know, if you read the book, it's really two mysteries. So one is the protagonist, and by the way, the whole novel is set against the background of COVID-19. But the protagonist is a medical resident finishing up his internal medicine residency, and is also dealing not only with COVID, but with the mysterious illness in his father, who keeps blacking out and going into comas. And he discovers, through the help of colleagues and ultimately a private investigator, that his father's being poisoned with something. So the first part of the mystery is, what is the poison? And the second part, which I won't reveal, is like, okay, now that we know what it is, who is giving the poison and to whom?
Right.
But to your point about pollutants, I'll give away the first mystery because it's only part of the book. But I'm focusing on a group of chemicals called dioxin. And to your point, these are commonly created chemicals created by a variety of manufacturing processes like smelting and related processes. And they're ubiquitous in the environment and ultimately get into the food chain. And it's virtually impossible to get rid of these chemicals once they're deposited in the fatty tissues of plants and animals. So we're all exposed to these dioxin compounds, and we all have measurable levels in our bodies, but fortunately not high enough to create problems. There have been, with this particular pollutant or toxin, there have been many examples in the past 50 years of overexposures, usually related to contamination of animal feeds or that sort of thing. And when you see those kinds of overexposures, you understand that this can cause a variety of health problems, including effects on the endocrine system, the immune system, and probably a cause of cancer as well. That's a little bit controversial. But that's the focus as the backbone for the story.
Don't you think that, in a way, pretty much dioxin is a blanket across the entire Earth already? And everybody may already have, just as you shared, different varying levels in your body. And, when you think about a diagnosis, like what's really wrong with someone, when they end up in the hospital. And it's like a litany of where you've been and what you've done. And you and I both know when you're older, it's sort of like, oh my gosh, do you have 100 years? And I'll sit here and tell you the story. Otherwise, it's pretty much you're kind of crapshooting at the, what's the hottest thing that just dings in your head, and let's start there. So, when you write it, when you write a novel about your character, it's sort of like, well, what's up with them is medications. That's always where you start. But then it's sort of like, well, I don't even know where to go next. That whole story, let's get to the root of the problem. I don't think there's any roots. I always say roots is what holds the earth together. There's bazillions of them from maybe even one tree, right? Yeah. Right.
Well, to get to your point about these chemicals being ubiquitous, yes, it's true, and not just true of dioxin. I actually, my interest in writing this particular novel probably started in, I think it was 2014, when you may know the story or may not, about the water supply in Flint, Michigan.
Right.
The major problem there was lead contamination, and lead has no relationship to the poisons we're talking about in this book. But few people know that many other toxins were discovered in that same water, and it was also contaminated heavily with bacteria. And the entire issue was not so much how to clean it up, but the government's reluctance to spend the time and the money to fix the problem that was affecting the health of their population. And it was finally fixed after a 3-year struggle. But it was back then that I kind of resurrected my own interest in this possibility of other toxins that are affecting us all of the time. Dioxin is real. The novel is fictitious and talks about its synthesis to create a poison to poison a human being. And that sounds fictional, but it isn't. In fact, as I read about in the book, back in 2004, interestingly, since we're in the middle of a Ukraine crisis today, it was the president of Ukraine who slowly but surely developed an awful-looking rash on his face. You can Google his name and look it up on the Internet. And the protagonist of my book stumbles upon this and discovers that rash is unique for chronic dioxin poisoning. And many years later, the ex-president of Ukraine who was poisoned blamed the Russians, of course, for it, and became chronically ill. But it was the facial rash that was the tip-off for Jace, who's the protagonist in my book.
Wow. Actually, the title of your book, Toxic Affairs on Hidden Lane, I was looking at it, and it's really hidden toxins, on a fair lane, right?
Well, that's a nice play on words, but the the title incorporates a number of, I guess, the two themes of the book behind the story are, one, poisonings that we've already touched upon, but the other is marital infidelity. Compared to toxic poisonings, which are rare, marital infidelity, unfortunately, is quite common. And that was in part why the word affairs appears in the title, because it was marital infidelity in the family being described in this book. This kind of the background for how dysfunctional they became and how this ultimately ended up in a murderous plot to get rid of the head of the family, the patriarch of the family, who himself was another physician, by the way.
Don't you think that in a way, truly what we're seeing when you talk about your book with all of these affairs, if you look back at it, your book is really a culmination of everything that was going on in the 50s, 60s, and 70s. I mean, there was no regulation on any toxins at that time. A lot of affairs were going on. It was post-war. People were trying to, assert their strength or their whatever, and they were all doing all kinds of crazy things. And it was still, before the Internet. So, you could kind of get away with anything as long as you could hide it really well. Don't you think that your book truly is like, it takes a culmination of all of that together and almost set in that time frame?
Well, I hadn't thought about it that way, but it probably does. And the one of the lead characters, the patriarch that I refer to, is kind of old school, born in Germany and migrating to the United States, and his own affair, which again became slowly and surely evident to his children that he was having a mistress on the side, was something that he hid for 20 years. But as I mentioned in the book, these were old school Europeans, and there are still probably European countries where having a mistress is considered almost normal or normal behavior. Right. And so I think you're right in the fact that this is behavior that goes back to an older generation, and we kind of handle affairs differently nowadays, don't we?
Even looking back at many of our ancestral lineages, I was trying to trace some of ours, and I'm thinking, what's wrong here? And they had changed their names. Part of them didn't even belong to the family, and a part of them kind of like went off, and they kind of made up another name, and then they just started going by that name. So I think
you mean these are European immigrants who Americanized their names? Is that what you're referring to? Well, you spelled my name. It's a Czech name or Slovak name, and interesting you should mention that, because I've struggled with that my entire life and my entire career, having a name that's hard to pronounce and hard to spell. And yes, I have several cousins and family members who Americanized their name and sort of gave up their Slovak heritage in part by doing that.
Yeah, and you don't even know who is who anymore. So it's almost when you come up to the end of the story, like in the end of your book, it's what really is the truth, who really belongs here, and how did we get here? And don't you think that definitely, I work a lot with end-of-life patients, and a lot of those secrets are really held until their last days. And, boy, it comes out in papers that are found in houses, or it comes out in, a mystery person will show up at your funeral. You don't know who or what they are doing there, and they just spill the beans, right?
Yep. In this case, there are a number of secrets. And, of course, I had fun writing the second part of the book, because it really becomes kind of a whodunit murder mystery. And we're not going to reveal who did it, right? Because that would spoil the mystery.
Yeah.
But
I love the
book. Basically, you're right. The protagonist, the young resident, in this investigation, just unleashed this whole litany of affairs, some of which were known about and some of which weren't known about, homosexual affairs where they weren't aware of that there was a family member who was actually homosexual. And so the secrets just came out as part of the investigation. And ultimately, I think even the main characters weren't expecting who the actual murder was going to be, but we'll keep that as a surprise for the readers.
Right. Well, you know what? If you look back at it, too, I mean, a lot of homosexual affairs in the early, I would say before 1990, pretty much all of them, 100% of them, were not out there. You couldn't find out information, and you really didn't know things. I mean, I was in New Orleans in the 80s, and I can definitely remember, cleaning the teeth of several patients, that had AIDS then, and it was before it was on the New York Times. It was on the headlines. So, we were pretty much in the forefront of it, but a lot of that, it was commonplace here, but it's not commonplace everywhere else. So sometimes people would move around, too, to hide their secrets, right?
Yeah, it's a different era, and probably on balance a good thing, although I'm actually, maybe I'm old school in some ways, but I'm certainly not homophobic, but I'm amazed how TV commercials now almost routinely pose, same-sex couples or interracial couples as though they're the normal backbone of America when they're still kind of in the minority. But I think it's a healthy thing because it's taking people out of the closet, so to speak. But that there is a homosexual character in the book, and that's as much as I'll say. But it's not a main theme that we were dwelling on as I wrote the book.
Let's talk, too, about your medical background, which was really great as it was woven through every single page, and being able to diagnose and the conversation. You almost feel like you're stepping into the main character and you're asking the questions, what's going on, what is this about, and we all know the medical complications of, well, hey, you're not the person on their sheet of paper that says you could be the power of attorney. Oh, that piece of paper. And if you even look at, in the past 2-3 years with the pandemic, they were not able to find power of attorney. They didn't have time. They didn't bother with that. It was just, hey, whoever answers the phone on the other end, we're good with that, Mm-hmm. So don't you think that the medical community is now changing and evolving and finding that they're getting stuck between legal issues and not legal issues?
Well, I can say a lot about the medical community in terms of the direction that it's taking. I mean, I'm retired now and frankly was happy to retire and get out of medicine, as we know. And medicine's become a big business, and it wasn't that way when I was in training and when I had my goals of what I wanted to be as a doctor. So, the community is changing. But you made a couple of points in your last comments, and one was, I think, the medical content of the book. I mean, as a physician author, one of the things I'm highly sensitive about is posing medical language that just turns off a non-medical reader. And I'm always looking for feedback from readers about, is this too much? You probably notice in this book and a couple of my other books, I've included a glossary at the end of the book in case people really can't figure out what a term means. I mean, to me, part of the fun of reading is learning. And I always use the analogy, I don't know the first thing about sailboats, but if I'm reading a novel that takes place on a sailboat, if the author happens to slip in some language about, the boat or the ropes or any of the other sailing equipment, I'm there to learn something. And the good author is the one who can sort of do that for you by not just dropping a term here or a medical term, to use my analogy or my situation, but to sort of drop that term with an explanation that makes it evident. But I still may be guilty of occasionally getting off into language where the reader says, I don't know what he's talking about here. And I hope that's not the case, but it might be.
No, I thought it was really wonderful because, but of course, I have 5 decades of medical stuff too. But I think the idea is that it really takes you as the reader to step into that position and say, gosh, I can remember, and it will trigger something. I can remember when my mother had something going on in the hospital, and this sounds very familiar. Could I get help? Would they answer my questions? We all know about advocates, how they're trying to be able to help a patient to be able to find out what's wrong so you can take care of them. Yet we really find ourselves sometimes at the mercy of anyone that's out there that says, oh, yeah, I have power of attorney, put them in a nursing home. Oh, I have power of attorney, give them a DNR, that kind of idea. It's so fluid these days. It's almost as if it's not reality at all, yet we believe it's based in reality.
Well, the whole issue of power of attorney, though, is something real that you can't ignore, Jeanette, right? And I think for most people, this isn't a life issue until you start dealing with elderly parents or elderly or sick relatives. I don't know if you know this because I know your background is in end of life experiences. But one of my other books is a memoir about my wife, who passed away at the age of 64 of severe dementia, and I wrote a memoir about how her illness and death affected me and the family and all the friends around her. But when she got ill, I was naive. I was a physician, still naive about living wills and powers of attorney. So say what you will about them, but it's also important that families think prospectively and proactively about these issues before they're dealing with it all of a sudden when they have an elderly patient on death's doorstep and they forgot that they didn't want to make them a DNR, that sort of thing. So these are important issues.
Absolutely, they are so vitally important. And we look at it. And, I was speaking to someone the other day on the show, and she said, that she was trying to navigate, be her mother's voice in the process because her mother was in the hospital, and all of the mistakes and the missteps and everything. But in essence, when you get to that point where your life there's a switch that's flipped, and you're now on this point of no return, that's a tough place to be because we kind of almost have to stand back and say, let's watch how it plays out. And that's what your book is. Pretty much, your main character had to stand back and watch how it played out because he couldn't control it, he couldn't fix it, he couldn't change it. He just had to observe and unfold the story.
Although I try to develop him as a character who is very controlling in a negative way, but ultimately through his wife and others realizes that he can't control everything that's happened in the past or things that happen in the future. So you're right on point about his character.
Yeah, it's definitely it's very unique. Do you know what I mean? Because what we truly see is that so many times people will say, I wish I could have helped too, but now I think your story is truly good for people that say, there was nothing I could have done differently. If their parents or their loved ones or whatever had something wrong and you couldn't help them, it had to play out. Or if people lived in a toxic area and they were exposed to toxins, well, we did the best we could to help them, and now we know better, and now we can move. So I think the idea is that sometimes when we look at novels, we think it's just a story just to pass the time or to be able to dance with the characters, but yet it truly is triggering about life experiences and for you to stand up and make a conscious decision next. How does that play out in my life, right?
Right. To your point about the toxins, another reality that was the basis for part of this book. I guess you could call it a reality, but I actually, in 1994, my 11-year-old son developed acute leukemia. And by the way, after a horrific illness that lasted almost 4 years, he's actually still alive, so he's a long-term cancer survivor, and that's a very rare form of leukemia to survive from. But at that time, I live in a neighborhood, still live in the same neighborhood. Over a period of about 5 or 6 years, there were several people in the neighborhood, some just a couple houses down, with cancers of various kinds. And I remember, and my street has a number of physicians and lawyers, and you can imagine the kinds of things we talk about, but there was a legitimate talk in the neighborhood about why are we seeing all these cancers? Are we living on some kind of toxic waste dump? And, we sort of lost interest in it. Eventually, most of us reasoned that the numbers of cancers weren't that higher than any other neighborhood in America, and they were all different cancers. And so the whole issue got dropped. But it was an issue that's always been in the back of my mind. And I actually wrote my very first novel that I wrote was basically based on the story of my son's leukemia and then fictionalized somewhat. But ever since that encounter, I've worried about this issue of toxins that we keep coming back to as the basis of the book.
Yeah, I mean, I live here in New Orleans. I mean, I live on Cancer Alley. I mean, there's the cyanide plant and storage is just 10 miles from my house. You know what I mean? So, hey, you know, there's toxins everywhere, you know, and Roundup is cooked, you know, on the other side. So I think the idea is that people say there's not much that we can do about the world as it is, and we have to become victims of the process. But yet, it's humans that are creating the processes. So how do we resonate that, and how do we still live through that?
Well, if I knew the answers to your questions, I would write another book and become a millionaire.
I'm stating you for your next book, Donald.
Thank you so much. No, I don't know what the answer is to your question, Jeanette. In the case of toxins, well, all right, let's take the example of dioxin. I told you it's the process, it's the final product of certain manufacturing processes. There are ways, and this is discussed in the novel, there are ways of eliminating these poisons. In this case, it requires very high temperature combustion, like temperatures in the thousands of degrees, something you don't get in a conventional oven in your kitchen. And the industries that have been to blame, by and large, stepped up after, you know, some early incidences around the world about dioxin poisonings in Italy and the story about Viktor Yushchenko from the Ukraine. So there are things that the manufacturing industries can do to prevent the development of these toxins. Right. Unfortunately, that doesn't help with the ones that are already out there. So to your point about what do we do, and it's just to some extent, you know, we're really not going to be able to deal with the toxins that are already in our food chains, for example.
Right. Yeah, you know, everybody's so worried about, hey, I want some stem cells to fix this in my body and that in my body or whatever, you know, and it's almost like peeing in the ocean because pretty much, you know, the ocean is pretty polluted, you know, so you're going to ask it all of a sudden to be able to regenerate itself. It's like, nah, I don't think so. So you wonder how our genes are going to be decades later, you know, and how our children are going to have all these residues and all of these, you know, all the exons and stuff on our DNA. You go, oh gosh, you know, I wonder what's going to happen. But then, you know, people are so short-minded, you know. They only worry about what's on their plate today and how their needs have been met and how they can, you know, just get through, right? Yeah,
you're painting kind of a scary picture. We all need to live our lives, however. I guess the answer to your question, we just do the best we can do, and whenever possible, try to avoid toxins of various kinds out there, and be proactive when it comes to industries that may be at fault for generating some of these pollutants.
Let's talk about, Dr. Donald, let's talk about the last part of your book a little lightly. And truly, I think that when people pass on and the secrets have been exposed, it's almost like people, when they go through the door, they leave their baggage. And, you know, I speak to clients and patients about this. I say they're going to go through the door of death and they can't take anything with them. It's almost as if their baggage has been spewed and now all that carnage is just laying there for someone else to clean it up. You know, my husband, he sells life insurance. You know, he'll go pick up a payment one day and then the next day he'll get a phone call to come back out, and he'll go back out and the person died that night and all their stuff's on the street already, you know.
Wow.
And people will say, but what is left of me? Well, in reality, you went through the door, there's nothing else, let it go. But it's the carnage that's left, the secrets, the exposures, the garbage that you've just dumped on other people, don't you think?
I think you're right, and I think there's an element of that in the portrayal of this family. Once the father passed away, I guess that's not giving away anything in the book because it is a murder mystery after all. But the family had to go on and deal with how these issues would affect their own lives. And if you read the book, the characters were affected in different ways. I mean, it's raised the question in my mind about writing a sequel to this book, because each of the siblings in this family had very different lives, but they were all affected by what they learned about their family and the toxins and the poisons and the marital infidelities, and it affected them going forward. I mean, you don't know what happened to them because it's a fiction at the end of the book, but there may be a reason to carry some of these characters into a sequel that gets more into the dealing with the family affairs that the father left behind.
Yeah, and it's, we wonder, when we look at ourselves and we say, am I living a truthful life? Am I doing the best for my health and my family? And we wonder, we look out, if there's a group of 100 people, we wonder, is everybody truly doing the best? And we kind of say, is that only me that's doing that, or has that belief or that truth? Mm-hmm. And is everybody else kind of messed up, or am I just living in a messed up world, right?
I mean, a little of both, I'd say.
Yeah.
Yeah, I hear you.
Yeah, because, there's so much coming out these days. I feel like I'm spinning in this kind of vortex of, you almost want to stand there with your mouth hanging open. You just don't even have a comment after that, right?
Right. Agree with that.
Yeah. Well, Dr. Donald, you have other books too. And can you share with the listeners how to find out more information about your work and your other books? That would be great.
Yeah, the best way I have a website, so if I can give you my website. Again, the name is spelled funny, so it's my first and last name, donald-hricik.com. So DONALDHRICIK.com. I do on the website have pictures of the covers of this book and my previous books. There are short synopses on the website, but they're kind of teasers meant to, if you want a bigger synopsis, buy the book. That sort of. And I also am an amateur artist. I've been painting for years, and now that I'm retired, I'm doing a little more of it. So for what it's worth, I post pictures of some of my paintings, and actually a couple of my sons are also amateur artists, so I post some of their work on that website as well. So the potential readers can look there. All the books are available on Amazon, and all except my first novel, which was called Racing to Pittsburgh. All of them are available as ebooks, except for the very first one. So Toxic Affairs is both a paperback and also an ebook. And frankly, I'm an avid fan of ebooks. They're, first of all, much less expensive, and I just think a convenient way to read. But if hardcore readers tell me all the time they just have to have that book in their hands to read it, and so not everybody likes ebooks, but I would recommend it to save money, if nothing else.
Yeah, I absolutely love, a handheld book, because my mind doesn't, I don't, on the computer, I'm kind of like, I forgot what I just read. It's sort of like that kind of idea, because when you read on the when you want to have all these emails on the computer, you want to read it, process it, and let it go. Well, that's why,
I guess in my academic life, I traveled a lot, and when I traveled and wanted to read on airplanes or in hotels and whatnot, I didn't want to put the Bible in my briefcase. Being on a Kindle or an ebook device is much more convenient. That's how I got started, but I read all my books on a Kindle device now, and I just think it's very convenient.
Cool. Well, Dr. Donald, I think it's really great, your book, Toxic Affairs on Hidden Lane. What I really loved about it is once you sat down and you started reading it, you truly could feel like you were in the pages, because there is something for everyone here. It doesn't matter your age, your generation. You could say, let me tell you a story. So it really brings up to be able to share some of your stories. It shares... it brings to reality and says, okay, maybe my story's not so bad. I can share it with my family. Or you can turn around and you could say, hey, is there any of this going on? And maybe some want to talk about it. And so novels are really good for bridging the gap, opening up our secrets or our deep thoughts. So I think your book is a great example of that.
Well, thank you for the compliment. Authors of fiction, I think the biggest challenge in writing good fiction is character development. So your comments about the characters being alive and feeling like you're living the life of the character, that's just what I intended to do, or what all authors intend to do. If you're telling a story just by describing the action, you're missing the excitement of writing fiction. The action has to come through the characters, and that's how you develop them, is telling the story through them, and not just describing a story and throwing in a couple characters here and there. So your comments are favorable, and I appreciate them. Thank you.
Yeah, I absolutely love it. This book is definitely a great spring read. If you've got a day, a few hours, just pick it up and just be able to start reading it. It's wonderful. We thank you so much, Dr. Donald, for sharing with us. And maybe we'll have you on with one of your other books, yes?
Well, that would be cool. I'd be happy to talk about any of them anytime, and I really appreciate this opportunity.
Very great. Well, thank you so much for joining us today. It was a pleasure to have you.
Thanks, Dr. Jeanette. Good luck to you.
Thanks. If you'd like more information about Dr. Donald-Hricik, again, the book is Toxic Affairs on Hidden Lane, a novel. Please do click on the link on the bottom of today's show page for more information and go directly to his website. Check out all of his other books. As he said, they're all on Kindle, and isn't that really cool? So you could sit down, read one after the other, and maybe you'll get through them this year. They're exciting reads, and definitely you feel like you step right into the character and be able to say, that's a little trigger. I can kind of join along because I've had something like that happen in my family, happen in my area, happen to me. And isn't that what we really want to be? We want to be in a story, see how it plays out, and share our moments in time. Thank you so much for joining us today. This is Dr. Jeanette-Gallagher. Until tomorrow, have a great day.
Today we discussed many life-changing concepts. Who do you turn to, and how do you know what is best when faced with a health crisis? Dr. Jeanette is a patient advocate. She listens to the patient, the doctors, and the family, clarifies the health issues and concerns, then helps the patient make the best choices going forward. If you would like help implementing change into your life and health, we can talk and see where you are stuck and how to improve the quality of your life. Check the link on the bottom of today's show page or visit dr-jeanette-gallagher.com to schedule a phone appointment today.